Harden Show. And now here's your host, Bob Harden.
Thanks so much for joining us here on the show. It's brought to you in part by the good folks at Johnson's Air Conditioning, Naples' longest established air conditioning company, as well as Gulf Shore Playhouse, bringing you professional New York-style theater at its very best. Visit the website, gulfshoreplayhouse.org. Coming up, we're going to visit with Jim McTague. He's a contributing editor to Barron's Magazine in Washington, D.C. Right now we have with us Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. You've seen him, I'm sure, on Fox News and other media outlets. He is the president and founder of the Islamic Forum for Democracy. He's also the author of a terrific book, The Battle for the Soul of Islam. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to be with you, Bob, as always. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Well, I had the opportunity to meet you. I guess it's been probably 8-10 years ago, right here in Naples, and started to learn about your cause, which is basically the separation of mosque and state, is it not? It's more around the internal reform of the religion of Islam.
Yeah, we basically were formed after 9/11 under the premise that terrorism is a symptom, and after ISIS was formed in Syria, all of a sudden the light went on and people realized, oh, that's what Dr. Jasser and the American Islamic Forum are doing, because our mission is to separate mosque and state, and ISIS, by declaring themselves an Islamic State, really did what we knew all Islamic groups that are Islamists want to do, which is to not only create Islamic states, but create states whose legal system is based in Sharia, who are basically theocracies. So if you want to really talk about who the founding fathers of ISIS are, they're Saudi Arabia, they're Qatar, these Islamic states that might seem to be our allies, but yet their very ideology, the systems, that the cauldrons that they brew are basically Islamic theocracies. And the only difference between ISIS and Saudi Arabia is ISIS is more of a grassroots, sort of viral, militant, radical movement, versus Saudi Arabia is a controlled corporate Islamic state, but yet does the same things. It beheads infidels. It treats women as fourth-class citizens. You can't build a church. You can't have any religious freedom. Moderate Muslims like myself are in jail and prisons. So the real allies for America are the ones in the jails, those reformers. And that's really what we're trying to do, is trying to educate Americans and engage Muslims in the fact that, this is a Muslim problem that needs a Muslim solution. And our current counterterrorism program is a whack-a-mole program, and it's going to continue to be a whack-a-mole until Islam gets beyond the 12th century and into the 21st century.
So interesting. I really enjoyed your book, The Battle for the Soul of Islam. I thought, first of all, I just want to acknowledge you for being so transparent in your own religion, your own marriage, and your own process, and how you experience Islam, which is so different from the way these Islamic terrorists are expressing their own religious views.
Well, thank you. And I think, that's the authenticity part that many people who want to look for hope, I think, will get not only from my book, from reading it, but from also relationships with Muslims, and that it's easy to sort of get lost in what the Wahhabis and the militants want you to get lost in, which is that, well, the Quran is a black and white book and there's no way to reform it. It's pretty much there that Islam, there's only one Islam, or there are many Islams. And I think most Muslims are like anybody, in that 99% of your faith you get from your family, you get from your moral upbringing, and then later you start to fill in the gaps with your theology. And if the theology that you're taught by the organized part of your faith doesn't fit, then you reform it yourself. Now, that's the grassroots sort of moderate Islam. Now, we're in denial if we think that the leadership of our faith have reformed, because you can't find in the textbooks in the mosques, etc., any Sharia texts that are in the 21st century. They all still, that are organized Islamic texts on Sharia law, are still like the Reliance of the Traveler in the 12th and 13th century that call for various draconian elements of Sharia law. And it's time for Muslims to step up, and that's what our Muslim reform movement has done in the last year, is to begin to step up and organize groups that are willing and honest enough to say that, the faith has a lot of work to do from an organized leadership perspective.
You know, your task is so huge, even here in the United States. I mean, you have organizations like CARE and others that are institutionalizing the whole notion of the Muslim Brotherhood and trying to give a message that does not necessarily support your own.
It is, and we've had a big disadvantage not only in the funding that we're up against, where these Islamic groups that have been engaged for 50 years now in the U.S. since the 60s, beginning with the Muslim Student Association and all of their legacy groups. The Muslim Brotherhood's program is to, in the West, where they're a minority, basically make America numb to the issue of political Islam, make them pay a price for even trying to say that Islam needs reform, and also basically instituting blasphemy laws in the West, where they don't call xenophobia or bigotry against Muslims that. They call it Islamophobia. Why? They want to equate any criticism of Islam with bigotry, so therefore you can't work towards reform, and they use Islam as an identity movement, as a victimization movement, rather than as an ideology, which is what Islam is. And our reform movement has, at the top of it, it says, ideas don't have rights, human beings do.
Yeah.
And thus, there's nothing that can't be criticized in Islam. Yes, we love our faith from a tough love perspective, but you have to say that there's no sacred elements to it that we say, well, no, you can't criticize that, and there's no blasphemy. That's absurd.
Do you have, right now, for example, in Christianity, we can embrace the Ten Commandments, for example, as kind of some guiding guideposts for our behavior. Is there a similar type of text in Islam? Well,
all of the Ten Commandments except the Sabbath you'll find in Islam. We have Friday, our day of prayer, but it's not a Sabbath. So it's amazing all other 9 are there. Now, they're not organized as 10 Commandments, per se, but there are certainly, the Quran is full of some pretty significant dictates from God to Muslims. Now, those are laws. The word Sharia itself as law is not in the Quran. It's very interesting that such a central part of Islamism is, for all practical purposes, the root word itself, Sharia, is very difficult to find in the Quran. So it sort of tells you that this is sort of a incarnation of theocrats. The word Sharia is all over the Hadith, which is the discussion of the Prophet. But most of that is going to be easier to reform than people would think, because it's just not authentic. It's felt to have been sort of fabricated after the Prophet's death, and the earliest hadith that are even felt to be authentic are 60, 70 years old after the Prophet's death. So it's harder to prove their authenticity the way you can the Quran. But again, those dictates in the Quran are from God to a human being. They're not saying your government shall so-and-so or your people shall mandate so. It says God says. So if you believe in a day of judgment and a reckoning, then it should be you should be allowed to live in a laboratory where you can make those sins, and God can judge you then, rather than living in a theocracy.
Yeah. Again, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, the founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. Currently, we're seeing the slaughter of Syrians. Or seeing what's happening with ISIS. Any comments with regard to the U.S. policy with regard to the Middle East and what's going on?
Well, I have to tell you, it's refreshing to finally see some in the campaign talk about policy specifics. I think, Mr. Trump's speech this week brought some substance, especially in immigration and vetting and using a test for ideology, which we've been calling for a long time, rather than simply saying a ban on all Muslims. But, you have to marry your approach to immigrants to the approach in the Middle East. And there seems to be, for really not just Mr. Trump, but a lot of America, this cognitive dissonance that somehow we can't get into nation building, we can't do that, it just doesn't work, we should have left the dictators there. Well, it's fascinating. The people that were calling our allies in the war on terror, be it Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Egypt, Jordan, that should be leading this battle, yes, on the one hand, that's correct. But on the other hand, they're not our allies. If you did a test for immigration for people who share our values of constitutionalism, none of the militaries in the Middle East, none of their rulers, their government heads would pass any of those tests. Why? They run Sharia states. So our real allies are in the prisons. And just as Reagan used to talk about Natan Sharansky, Solzhenitsyn, and others that are in the prisons of the Soviet Union in the 20th century that were our real allies, we need a robust foreign policy that uses one doctrine, one lens to say about people that want to come to the U.S. that share our values, but also says in the Middle East, regime change has to happen. It might make things more chaotic, but the only other option is what Obama's doing with Iran, which is regime development and regime, construction, which is not good.
Yeah.
That actually solidifies the relationship with Russia. The billions going to Iran is going to help further the slaughter of Syrians and basically feed a genocide. And it's going to make us have to get closer to the Sunnis of Saudi Arabia and Egypt and continue to develop their regimes in which they're going to, in their cauldrons, spread the ideas of radical Islam even more than they have now. So the economic openings to these countries actually facilitates global terrorism. It's a mirage to say that regime development somehow is more stable. In fact, Al-Qaeda came and attacked us in 9/11 because of the economic openings and shift connection of monies in the hundreds of millions and billions between Saudi Arabia and the U.S. And we're going to continue to see that more and more unless we actually begin to do sanctions and work towards regime change there.
Unbelievable. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, again, I'm going to encourage you to read the book, The Battle for the Soul of Islam. Terrific read. Also, The Third Jihad. Go to YouTube and look at The Third Jihad if you want to find out what's happening with regard to Sharia law and communities in America. The Third Jihad. Dr. Jasser, and what your website for, I've forgotten the name of the website for your organization.
Yeah, two websites that most people know about. One is aifdemocracy.org, aifdemocracy.org, and there's a new website we're launching in the next week. It's called takebackislam.com, takebackislam.com.
Doctor, I genuinely appreciate your coming on the show. Thanks so much for joining us.
Anytime. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you so much. All right, coming up. Great man, and believe me, his life is not easy because of the positions that he's taken. CARE and other organizations do not like his message.